Your personal problems are not the city's problem, madam. The mayor's voice was a blade of ice, slicing through the stunned silence of the council chamber. Alejandra stood frozen at the podium, her heartfelt plea for her son's community center lying shattered at her feet. In front of the cameras, in front of her neighbors, she had been publicly executed, dismissed as nothing. He thought he had silenced a single insignificant voice. He never imagined that in that moment of supreme arrogance, he hadn't ended a conversation. He had just started a revolution. Welcome back to Epic Narrative Tales, where we release powerful stories for your enjoyment. Grab your blanket and your popcorn. This story is an incredible one. The Northwood Neighborhood Hub was the city's living room. It was a sprawling, slightly ramshackle brick building that smelled of old books, fresh coffee, and the boundless chaotic energy of hope. For Alejandra, it was a sanctuary. It was where her 7-year-old son, Mateo, his small lungs still so sensitive to the world's harshness, could spend his afternoons in a clean, well-ventilated space surrounded by friends. It was where she, a single mother juggling 2 jobs, could find a moment of peace, a cup of tea, a community that felt like a family. The Hub was the one place in Northwood, Minnesota that felt like it belonged to everyone. The notice appeared on a Tuesday, a single, sterile sheet of paper taped to the Hub's front door, its bureaucratic language a stark, cold intrusion. Notice of decommissioning and municipal reallocation. The words were a death sentence. The Hub, their sanctuary, was being closed, its land reallocated. To a luxury condo developer, the whispers said, the heart of their community was being torn out to make way for a palace most of them could never afford to even walk past. Despair settled over the neighborhood like the first bitter snow of a long Minnesota winter. But for Alejandra, despair was a luxury she couldn't afford. Fueled by a mother's fierce protective love and a quiet, unshakable faith, she began to work. She spent a week going door to door, gathering signatures. She researched zoning laws, city ordinances, and the mayor's own public promises about community investment. She prepared a speech, not of anger, but of facts, of heart, of a community's desperate, reasonable plea. Miles away, in a corner office on the top floor of the Northwood City Hall, Mayor Richard Thorne was looking at a different kind of blueprint. He stood with a developer, a man with a predatory smile and a $1,000 suit, looking at an architectural model of the gleaming glass and steel condominium tower that would soon replace the eyesore of the community hub. It's a legacy project, Richard, the developer purred, clapping the mayor on the back. A monument to your vision for this city. Mayor Thorne smiled, a practiced, empty gesture. He was a third-generation politician, a man who had inherited his power like a piece of antique furniture. He saw Northwood not as a living, breathing community, but as a portfolio of assets to be leveraged. The Hub was a low-performing asset. This deal, this gleaming tower, was a lucrative one. The math was simple. The people, their stories, their needs, they were just inconvenient, sentimental noise. The council is on board, Thorne said, his voice the smooth, confident hum of a man who has never been told no. They'll make some noise and then they'll forget. They always do. He had no idea that a quiet, determined Latina mother was about to make a noise he would never be able to forget. The city council chamber was designed to intimidate. The dais where the mayor and the council sat was elevated, a throne of dark, polished wood that looked down on the humble speaker's podium. The air was heavy with the weight of bureaucratic indifference. But Alejandra, standing at that podium, was not intimidated. She was terrified, but she was not intimidated. Her fear was a small, fluttering bird in her chest. Her love for her son and her community was a lion. She looked out at the assembled faces, the council members looking bored and impatient, the small crowd of her neighbors, her people, their faces etched with a fragile, desperate hope. And at the center of it all, Mayor Thorne, leaning back in his high-backed leather chair, a look of profound, condescending boredom already settling on his handsome, patrician features. She took a deep breath, her knuckles white where she gripped the edges of the podium, and she began. Her voice, at first a nervous tremble, grew stronger and clearer with every word. She did not yell, she did not plead, she built a case. She spoke of the facts, of the Hub's vital after-school programs, of the senior citizen wellness checks, of the ESL classes that were a lifeline for new immigrant families. She presented her research, quoting the city's own charter on protecting community spaces. She unrolled the petition, a scroll of 1,000 signatures, a testament to the community's unified voice. Then she spoke from the heart. She told them about Mateo, about his asthma, about how the Hub's clean, safe air was the one place he could breathe freely. She spoke of Mrs. Gable, an elderly widow who relied on the Hub's daily hot meal for her only real human contact of the day. She painted a picture, not of an underperforming asset, but of a thriving, beating, and essential heart. This center is not a building, Mayor Thorne, she concluded, her voice ringing with a powerful, quiet clarity. It is the living soul of our neighborhood, and we are just asking, we are begging you not to sell our soul to the highest bidder. She finished, her heart pounding, her entire being poured into that single desperate plea. A smattering of applause broke out from her neighbors in the audience. The council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. She had been effective. She had been powerful. She had made them feel something. And for Mayor Thorne, that was an unforgivable sin. He hated being made to feel. He hated being reminded of the messy, inconvenient, unprofitable lives of the people he was supposed to represent. He leaned forward, his microphone hissing to life. He did not address the facts of her speech. He did not acknowledge the petition. He addressed her. He made it personal. "Thank you for that passionate display, madam," he began, his voice a silken, condescending purr. He looked at her, a small, dismissive smile playing on his lips. "It is always moving to see how personally our citizens take these small administrative matters." The words were calculated belittlement, reducing her powerful, researched plea to a hysterical, emotional outburst. "However," he continued, his voice hardening slightly, "the city of Northwood cannot and will not base its long-term strategic planning on one mother's anecdotal childcare needs. We are talking about progress, about revitalizing a stagnant part of our city's portfolio." He gestured dismissively. "Your personal problems are not the city's problem, madam." The final sentence was a blade of ice. It was a public execution. He had not just rejected her plea, he had invalidated her, dismissed her, and her entire community's struggle as a personal problem. He had, in front of the cameras, in front of her neighbors, in front of the entire city, declared her and people like her to be irrelevant. A stunned, shocked silence fell over the room. Alejandra stood frozen at the podium, the color draining from her face. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot, searing wave that threatened to consume her. She had come here with hope, with faith in the system, and he had met her with a contempt so profound it was a declaration of war. He thought he had won. He thought he had silenced her, put her in her place, ended the conversation. But as she stood there, absorbing the full, brutal impact of his arrogance, something inside her, something that had been quiet and patient her whole life, finally caught fire. The hurt, the humiliation, it all burned away, and what was left was a core of pure, cold, righteous anger. An anger that felt in that moment like the voice of God himself, whispering a single powerful word in her soul. Enough. She looked at him, at his smug, self-satisfied face, and she made a silent, holy vow. He had just made the biggest mistake of his political life. He had not just dismissed a citizen, he had created an adversary. Alejandra walked out of the city council chamber in a daze. The sympathetic glances from her neighbors, their quiet words of, "You were great, Ale," barely registered. The mayor's words echoed in her head, a cruel, relentless loop. Your personal problems are not the city's problem. He had taken her heart, her hope, her community's collective plea, and had ground it into dust under the heel of his political boot. The drive home was a blur. When she walked into her small, quiet apartment, the feeling of defeat was so absolute it was a physical weight. She sank onto her sofa, the carefully prepared notes for her speech still clutched in her hand, now just a useless collection of paper. She felt foolish, naive. She had actually believed that one person armed with the truth could make a difference. She had been wrong. Mateo was spending the night with a friend, and in the silence of the empty apartment, the full, crushing weight of her powerlessness descended upon her. She was a single mother, a renter, a woman juggling 2 jobs, a tiny, insignificant cog in a machine run by men like Mayor Thorne. What could she possibly do? He had the power, the money, the influence. He had already dismissed her. She was, as he had so cruelly implied, irrelevant. Tears of frustration and a deep, soul-crushing despair began to fall. This was not just about a community center. It was about her own invisibility. It was the story of her life, a good, hard-working, but ultimately powerless woman being walked over by a world that didn't see her. She wept until she had no tears left, until she was just a hollowed-out vessel of exhaustion. She almost gave up. She almost accepted the bitter, cynical truth Thorne's world was selling, that people like her didn't matter. But then, her gaze fell upon a small framed photo on her bookshelf. It was her Abuela, her grandmother, a woman with a spine of steel and a faith as vast and unshakable as the Minnesota sky. Her grandmother had been a union organizer in the meatpacking plants, a small, fiery woman who had faced down men far more powerful and far more threatening than Mayor Thorne. Mija, her Abuela's voice echoed in her memory, a warm, strong sound. They can only make you feel small if you agree with them. You are a daughter of God. Never, ever agree to be small. The memory, the strength of her lineage, was a spark in the darkness. Alejandra wiped her tears, a new, different emotion beginning to take root. The righteous anger from the council chamber, which had been smothered by her despair, began to smolder again. Thorne had not just insulted her, he had insulted the memory of every strong woman who had come before her. He had insulted her faith. This was her test. Not a test of her political power, she had none. It was a test of her spirit. Would she agree to be small, or would she stand up, even if she had to stand alone? She got up from the sofa, walked to her small kitchen table, and opened her old second-hand laptop. She didn't have money, she didn't have political connections, but she had a voice, and she had the truth. Her hands, still trembling slightly, moved over the keyboard. She opened Facebook. She thought for a long, hard moment, and then she created a new private group. She typed in the name, a simple, powerful declaration of intent, Northwood for All. This was her sanctuary now, not a physical space, but a digital one, a place where the dismissed and the invisible could gather. She took the first terrifying and profoundly brave step. She wrote the first post. She didn't rant, she didn't rage, she simply told her story. The story of the hub, of her son, of the council meeting. She uploaded the video of the mayor's condescending dismissal, and then she invited the first 10 members, the handful of neighbors who had come to the meeting, the elderly woman from the hub, the single father whose kids used the after-school program. She clicked Create Group. She sat back, her heart pounding. It was such a small, insignificant act in the face of such a massive, indifferent power structure, a tiny digital seed planted in the middle of a frozen political winter. It would probably amount to nothing. It would probably wither and die in the silence, but it was something. It was a refusal to be small. It was an act of faith. And as she sat there in the quiet of her apartment, watching the first few accepted invitation notifications pop up on her screen, she felt the first fragile tendrils of a new kind of power begin to root. The first 24 hours were a trickle, not a flood. A dozen people joined the Northwood for All Facebook group, then 24. They were the people Alejandra knew, the faces from the hub, the names from her petition. Their first comments were cautious, a mixture of sympathy for Alejandra and a weary, resigned anger at the mayor. "You were so brave, Ale. It's a disgrace what he's doing. It's no use, Thorne always gets his way. The despair was still thick. They were a collection of isolated, wounded individuals, not a movement. Alejandra knew that for this to become something real, it had to move from the cold, impersonal space of the internet to the warm, breathing space of a shared room. She posted again, a simple invitation. We can't be the only ones. Let's talk. Church of St. Jude, basement meeting room, Thursday night at 7 p.m. Coffee and cookies will be provided. That Thursday, the air in the church basement was damp and smelled of old hymnals and coffee that had been brewing a little too long. Alejandra had set up a circle of 20 mismatched metal folding chairs. She was terrified that only 5 people would show up, that the silence in this room would be even more defeating than the one in her apartment. At 7:05, there were only 6 people there, including her. Her heart sank. But then, a few more trickled in. A young couple, an elderly man with a walker, a woman in a nurse's uniform, her face etched with exhaustion. By 7:15, all 20 chairs were full, and a few people were standing awkwardly by the back wall. They were a motley, improbable crew of revolutionaries, a retired schoolteacher, a Somali immigrant who owned a small grocery store, a young, fiery college student, a quiet mechanic, a perfect cross-section of the people Mayor Thorne had dismissed as noise. Alejandra stood before them, her hands trembling, holding a sheet of notes she couldn't read. She took a deep breath and abandoned the notes. She just spoke. "Thank you for coming," she began, her voice quiet but clear. "I know it's a lot to ask, to come out on a cold night, to believe that something can change when we've all been taught that it can't. I don't have a grand plan. I don't have any political experience. All I have is my story." She told it again, the story of Mateo, of the hub, of the public humiliation at the council meeting. But this time it was different. She wasn't a supplicant pleading for a favor. She was a witness testifying to an injustice. When she finished, a heavy silence filled the room. Then the retired schoolteacher, a woman named Carol, spoke up. "He did the same thing to the library's literacy program," she said, her voice trembling with a long-held anger. "Called it fiscally irresponsible and cut its funding to give a tax break to one of his developer friends. I had to lay off 2 tutors. Kids who were just starting to read are falling behind again." The Somali grocer, Mr. Abdi, stood. "Our street," he said, his accent thick but his words powerful. "Our street lights have been broken for 6 months. 6 months. We have called. We have filed petitions. Nothing. My wife, she is afraid to walk home from work after dark. He does not care about our safety. We are not the right neighborhood." Suddenly, the floodgates opened. The healing ritual began. One by one, they shared their stories. A story of a pothole-ridden street that the city refused to pave. A story of a small business permit that was endlessly, inexplicably delayed. A story of a park that had fallen into disrepair. Each one was a personal problem, a small, isolated injustice. But as the stories were told, as they overlapped and intertwined, a new, terrifying, and powerful picture began to emerge. This was not a series of isolated incidents. It was a pattern, a deliberate, systemic neglect of the parts of the city that didn't serve the mayor's interests and a funneling of resources to the wealthy and the well-connected. They were not just a collection of individuals with grievances. They were a community of the deliberately ignored. The shared pain, the collective anger, it was a powerful, transformative alchemy. It burned away their individual despair and forged a new collective resolve. They were not alone. Their problems were not personal. Their problem was Mayor Thorne. Alejandra, listening to the chorus of voices, felt a profound shift inside her. This was no longer just her fight. She had simply been the one who had lit the match. The kindling was already there, dry and brittle, in every corner of the city. The young college student, a man named Ben with a fire in his eyes, stood up. "So what do we do?" he asked, the question hanging in the air, electric with a new, dangerous possibility. "We can't just sit here and talk. We have to do something." All eyes turned to Alejandra. She had called them here. She had started this. They were looking to her not as a politician, but as the one who had been brave enough to speak first. The test of overcoming her own powerlessness was over. A new, far more terrifying test had just begun, the test of leadership.
She looked at the faces in the room, at their expectant, hopeful, and slightly fearful eyes, and she felt the weight of their collective trust settle on her shoulders. She took a deep breath, and a quiet, unshakable sense of purpose filled her. "You're right, Ben," she said, her voice steady and strong. "We do something. We make sure he can't pretend we're invisible anymore. We make a noise he can't ignore."
The first battleground was digital. Guided by Ben, the tech-savvy college student, the Northwood for All Facebook group transformed from a quiet support group into a powerful organizing hub. They started a public page, and the stories shared in the church basement became its fuel. They posted a video of the crumbling, neglected playground right next to a picture of the brand-new publicly funded fountain in front of the new luxury condo building. They created a pothole of the week feature with pictures of residents holding signs with humorous, angry slogans. They used the city's own data, unearthed by the retired teacher Carol, to create simple, devastating infographics showing the disparity in city spending between the wealthy districts and their own. It was a brilliant grassroots campaign of truth, and it began to work. The page's followers grew from dozens to hundreds, then to thousands. The local news, which had long ignored the city's quiet injustices, started to take notice. A small independent news blogger wrote a feature story, The Ignored of Northwood, how a single mother's Facebook group is exposing City Hall's neglect. For the first time in a long time, the people of Northwood felt a flicker of hope. They were not just shouting into the void, they were being heard. The movement was gaining momentum. And that was when the mayor's machine began to fight back. It started subtly. Anonymous accounts, trolls, began to appear in the comments section of the Northwood for All page. They were vicious, personal, and clearly coordinated. "This Alejandra lady is just a bitter, failed activist trying to get her 15 minutes of fame. If you people worked as hard as you complain, maybe your neighborhoods wouldn't be such a mess." Another handout brigade, trying to blame the government for their own bad choices. Then the attacks became more personal. A photo of Alejandra's modest, slightly run-down apartment building was posted with the caption, "She wants to tell the city how to manage its budget, but she can't even afford a decent place to live." This was the grief retreat. It was a deliberate, cynical campaign to reframe their righteous anger as the bitter whining of unsuccessful people. It was an attempt to make them feel small again, to make them feel ashamed of their own poverty, their own struggle. It was a digital version of the same contemptuous dismissal Alejandra had faced in the council chamber. And it began to work. The joyful, defiant energy in the group started to curdle. People became hesitant to post their stories, afraid they would be the next target. The hopeful comments were drowned out by the noise of the trolls. The momentum faltered. The initial exhilarating hope was challenged by a creeping familiar fear and doubt. Had they been foolish to think this would be so easy? Were they just a joke, a collection of complainers tilting at windmills? The lowest point came when a well-known local radio host, a man known to be a mouthpiece for the mayor, dedicated a segment of his show to mocking them. He called them the Northwood Grievance Committee and singled out Alejandra by name. "You have this woman, this single mother," he had sneered, his voice dripping with condescension, "who thinks that because she has a Facebook page, she knows more about urban planning than a 3-term mayor. It's the arrogance of the amateur. It's sad, really." Alejandra heard the broadcast in her car on the way to her second job. The public, personal humiliation was a gut punch. It brought back the feeling of that night in the council chamber, the feeling of being a small, insignificant gnat buzzing in the face of immense, unshakable power. That night, at their weekly meeting in the church basement, the mood was funeral. The energy was gone, replaced by a defeated silence. "My son saw the comments online," her voice barely a whisper. "He asked me why people were being so mean. How do I explain this to him?" "Maybe Thorne is right," another man said, the fight gone from his voice. "Maybe we are just a joke. We can't win this." The despair, the old familiar enemy, was creeping back into the room. The fragile coalition was beginning to fracture under the first real pressure. They had been brave in their small, safe world, but the real world was proving to be as cruel and unforgiving as they had always feared. The hope of their movement was dying. They called her arrogant. They called her a joke. They tried to shame her back into silence.
This is the oldest trick of the powerful, to mock the courage of those who dare to speak up. But a voice once found is a hard thing to silence. If you've ever been ridiculed for standing up for what is right, if you believe that a just cause is worth fighting for even when it feels hopeless, then your subscription is an act of defiance. It's a vote that says you will not be silenced.
Alejandra sat in the center of the quiet, defeated circle in the church basement, and she felt the fragile hope of their movement slipping away. The mayor's tactics were working. He was using shame as a weapon, and it was a poison that was paralyzing them. She could let it happen. She could let the group dissolve. Another noble but failed effort, another testament to the futility of fighting City Hall. But then she looked at the faces around her. She saw Carol, the retired teacher, her face etched with a lifetime of quiet dignity. She saw Mr. Abdi, the grocer, whose only crime was wanting his wife to be able to walk home safely. She saw the fear, yes, but beneath it, she saw the same smoldering ember of righteous anger that had been lit in her own soul. They were not a joke. Their pain was not a punchline. She stood up, her movement drawing the weary eyes of the room. She was not the hesitant, nervous woman who had first stood before them. The fire of the last few weeks had burned away her fear, leaving a core of pure, unshakable conviction. "So that's it?" she asked, her voice quiet but ringing with a power that made everyone sit up a little straighter. "We're just going to let them win? We're going to let a radio host with a cheap suit and a cheaper soul tell us who we are?" She looked around the circle. "They call us the grievance committee. They call me an amateur. They mock my apartment. Why? Because it's the only weapon they have. They can't attack our facts. They can't defend the mayor's record of neglect. So they attack us. They try to make us feel small, to feel ashamed, to retreat back into the silence where they are comfortable." She walked into the center of the circle, her gaze meeting each person's. "I am a single mother. I do live in a small apartment, and I am damn proud of it, because every single day I get up and I fight for a better life for my son in a city that has made it clear it does not care about him. That is not a source of shame. That is a source of strength." Her voice began to rise, not with anger, but with the passion of a Sunday sermon. "And you," she said, pointing to Carol, "you are not just a retired teacher. You are a guardian of our children's future. And you," she said, pointing to Mr. Abdi, "you are not just a grocer. You are a pillar of your community, a man who provides for his neighbors. We are not a collection of grievances. We are a coalition of the committed. We are the conscience of this city." She paused, letting the words sink in, the air in the room electric. "They want to fight us with whispers and shadows on the internet? Fine, then we will fight them in the light. We will no longer be a Facebook group. We will be a movement. We will take our fight from behind the screens and put it onto the streets, where they cannot delete us, where they cannot ignore us, where they will have to look us in the eye." A new fire was being lit in the room, passed from her soul to theirs. The despair was burning away, replaced by a hardened, defiant resolve. They were reconciling not with each other, but with their own courage. "This Saturday," she declared, her voice ringing with the authority of a general, "is the mayor's annual Progress and Prosperity Breakfast. It's his big, fancy fundraiser with all his developer friends. He thinks we're just a bunch of anonymous trolls on the internet. Let's go introduce ourselves." The plan was simple, audacious, and brilliant. They would not picket, they would not shout, they would not give him the satisfaction of dismissing them as an angry mob. That Saturday morning, as Mayor Thorne stood at a podium in a lavish hotel ballroom, preparing to deliver a self-congratulatory speech to a room of the city's wealthiest and most powerful citizens, the doors at the back of the ballroom opened, and in walked Alejandra, and behind her, Carol, and behind her, Mr. Abdi, and behind them, a silent, steady, and unending stream of the people he had ignored. 50 of them, then 100. They were black, white, Latino, Somali, young, old, dressed in work clothes and Sunday best. They were the living, breathing embodiment of Northwood for all. They did not speak. They did not carry signs. They simply filed into the center of the ballroom and stood, their arms crossed, their faces calm, their gazes fixed on him. Their silence was 1,000 times louder than any shout. It was a powerful, undeniable, and deeply unsettling presence. The mayor faltered.
The room of donors turned in their seats, their comfortable self-congratulatory breakfast suddenly invaded by the inconvenient, silent reality of the city they were profiting from. The local news cameras, there to cover the mayor's speech, swiveled to capture this stunning, silent protest. Mayor Thorne tried to continue his speech, but his words of progress and prosperity sounded hollow, ridiculous in the face of the hundred silent, accusing glares. He stumbled. He lost his place, his face flushed with a mixture of anger and humiliation. They had done it. They had moved beyond the screens. They had stepped into the light, and in their silent, powerful unity, they had shown the mayor and the entire city that they were not a joke. They were not invisible. They were a force. And their fight had only just begun.
The silent protest at the mayor's breakfast was a declaration of war. It was the lead story on the local news that night, the image of 100 silent, determined citizens staring down a flustered Mayor Thorne, a powerful and compelling visual. The Northwood for All movement was no longer a fringe group. It was a credible and increasingly powerful political force. But Alejandra knew that a single symbolic victory was not enough. To create real change, they had to move beyond protest and begin to dismantle the mayor's power structure. Their next target was not the mayor himself, but the source of his power, his corrupt deals. Their external attack was a masterpiece of strategic grassroots pressure. They focused on the luxury condo project, the one that was the catalyst for their entire movement. The developer, a man named Sterling, a man with a slick smile and a history of cutting corners, was Mayor Thorne's biggest donor and his closest ally. Alejandra and her team, which now included a pro bono lawyer and a retired accountant, dug into the deal. They found what they were looking for, a web of zoning variances, suspicious tax breaks, and a sale price for the community hub's land that was so far below market value it was practically a gift. Armed with this information, they didn't just go to the press, they went to the people. They launched a boycott. "Don't feed Thorne's corruption," the flyers read. They papered the city with information about Sterling Development, linking the company directly to the mayor's neglect of their neighborhoods. They stood outside the sales office for the new condo building, not shouting, but handing out leaflets that calmly, clearly detailed how the project was being funded by the city's own neglect. At first, the boycott was a trickle, but then it became a flood. Local businesses, spurred on by Mr. Abdi, began to put up "We Support Northwood for All" signs in their windows. A prominent local church delivered a sermon on the moral duty to stand against civic injustice, and its collection plate that week went entirely to the movement's legal fund. The most significant blow came from an entirely unexpected direction. A man named David Chen, a respected second-generation owner of a large local construction supply company, publicly announced that he was pulling his company's bids from all Sterling Development projects. He was one of their biggest suppliers. In a statement to the press, he said, "My father built this business on a handshake and a promise to help build this city, not to plunder it. I cannot, in good conscience, be a part of a project that is so clearly harming the communities we are supposed to serve. We stand with Northwood for All." David Chen was their first, powerful, and completely unlikely ally. He was a wealthy business leader, a member of the very establishment Thorne represented. His defection was a massive symbolic blow to the mayor's credibility. It signaled that the opposition was no longer just a bunch of complainers. It was a serious cross-community coalition. The boycott began to bite. Sterling Development sales stalled. Their investors grew nervous. The bad press was becoming a national story. The developer, once the mayor's staunchest ally, was now a liability. The pressure on Mayor Thorne was immense. The cracks in the foundation of his regime were beginning to show. He reacted not with negotiation, but with aggression. He ordered the police to increase their presence at the movement's peaceful protests, hoping to intimidate them. He tried to fast-track the demolition permits for the community hub, a desperate move to make their fight a moot point. But the movement was always one step ahead. They had sources inside City Hall now, disillusioned clerks and administrators who had grown sick of the mayor's corruption. Tipped off about the demolition, Alejandra and her team organized their most audacious act yet. The night before the bulldozers was scheduled to arrive, 200 citizens of Northwood, led by Alejandra, David Chen, and a host of local clergy, surrounded the community hub.
They linked arms, forming a human chain around the building. They brought blankets, thermoses of coffee, and a quiet, unshakable resolve. When the demolition crew arrived at dawn, they were met with a silent, immovable wall of human beings. The news cameras, tipped off by Ben, were there to capture it all. The image of a beloved community center, a symbol of hope and unity, being protected by the city's own bulldozers by a human chain of its own citizens, was a devastating, iconic image. It was the tipping point. The mayor could not, politically, send in the police to arrest teachers and pastors and small business owners. He was trapped. His authority was a joke. His power, once so absolute, was revealed to be a fragile, hollow thing. The unstoppable force of the people, a force he had dismissed and ridiculed, had finally, completely, and publicly cornered him. The stage was set for his final, ignominious collapse.
The human chain around the Northwood Hub became the defining image of the struggle. For 3 days, the citizens of Northwood held their ground, their numbers swelling as more and more people joined the line. It became a city-wide pilgrimage, a festival of defiance. Food was donated, musicians played, and stories were shared. It was no longer a protest, it was a community reclaiming its own heart. The national media descended. The story of the Northwood siege was on every major news network, a perfect David and Goliath narrative. Mayor Thorne, who had once commanded the media with an iron fist, was now a national symbol of political arrogance and corruption. He was in a free fall, and he knew it. The final blow, however, came not from the protest line, but from a quiet, unassuming journalist. An independent investigative reporter named Sarah Jensen, who had been following the Northwood for All movement for weeks, had been digging into Thorne's land deal with a quiet, relentless precision. The anonymous sources from inside City Hall, now emboldened by the public uprising, had given her the smoking gun. On the 3rd day of the siege, her story broke online, a bombshell of meticulously documented evidence. It was a devastating exposé, complete with leaked emails, falsified land assessments, and a clear, undeniable money trail that led from Sterling Development through a series of shell corporations directly to a private account owned by Mayor Thorne. He had not just given his friend a sweetheart deal, he had been paid handsomely for it. It was blatant criminal corruption. The story was the tipping point. It was no longer a matter of political disagreement, it was a matter of felony. The district attorney announced an immediate investigation. The developer, Sterling, seeing the writing on the wall, immediately flipped, offering to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for leniency. The final city council meeting of Mayor Thorne's career was a scene of almost Shakespearean tragedy. It was a mandatory public hearing called in response to the explosive journalistic report. The chamber was packed to the rafters with the citizens he had once dismissed, their faces no longer hopeful or pleading, but hard, cold, and victorious. Alejandra sat in the front row, a quiet, powerful presence. Thorne arrived looking like a ghost. The smug, arrogant confidence was gone, replaced by a pale, sweaty desperation. He had come not to govern, but to fight for his political life. He took his seat at the elevated dais, a king on a throne that was already beginning to burn. He tried to bluster his way through it. He called the report a partisan witch hunt, a smear campaign orchestrated by his political enemies. He tried to attack the journalist's credibility. He tried to portray himself as the victim. But his words, once so powerful and commanding, were now the weak, pathetic ramblings of a man cornered. No one was buying it. Not the press, not the public, and most importantly, not the people sitting next to him. The shatter point, the final definitive collapse, came from his own ranks. Councilman Davies, a man who had been a loyal, if reluctant, ally of Thorne's for a decade, a man who had voted with him on dozens of questionable deals, finally stood up. His face was grim. "Mayor Thorne," Davies began, his voice shaking but clear, I have served this city for 20 years, and I have, at times, given you the benefit of the doubt. But the evidence presented in this report, the clear, undeniable betrayal of the public trust, I cannot, in good conscience, continue to support your administration." He looked out at the crowd, his gaze landing on Alejandra. "The people of this city have spoken, and it is our duty to listen." He turned back to Thorne. "I am officially calling for an immediate recall election, and I am asking for your resignation for the good of the city." One by one, like dominoes falling in slow, agonizing succession, the other council members who had once been his allies stood and echoed the call. They abandoned him, publicly, brutally. The loyalty he had commanded, a loyalty built not on respect but on a shared interest in power and profit, had evaporated the moment he became a liability. Thorne sat there, utterly alone at his grand polished dais, the foundations of his entire world having crumbled beneath him. He looked out at the sea of faces, at the citizens he had ignored, at the allies who had betrayed him, and finally his gaze fell on Alejandra. She was not gloating, she was not smiling. Her expression was one of a solemn, sad, and profound vindication. In her eyes he saw not the face of his vanquisher, but the face of his own catastrophic failure. He had underestimated her, he had dismissed her. He had tried to make her small, and in the end she had become a giant who had, with the quiet, unstoppable force of the people, completely and utterly toppled his regime. He had lost. The fall was swift and absolute. Stripped of his allies and facing certain indictment, Mayor Richard Thorne resigned the next morning. His announcement a quiet, humiliating press release that was a mere footnote to the seismic shift that had just occurred. His regime, once an unshakable monolith, had not just been defeated, it had been erased. The city of Northwood did not erupt in riotous, vengeful celebration. The grand gesture was not a party in the streets. It was something far more profound. It was a citywide, collective exhale. It was the sound of a community, so long held down by the suffocating weight of cynicism, finally breathing freely again. On the Saturday after Thorne's resignation, the citizens gathered at the Northwood Neighborhood Hub, the very building that had been the catalyst for their revolution. It was not a victory rally. It was a community meeting, a planning session. The human chain that had once surrounded the building to protect it now filed inside to rebuild their own future. Alejandra stood not at a podium, but in the center of the circle of familiar, hopeful faces. She was no longer just the reluctant leader of a protest. She was the respected, beloved heart of a newly empowered community. The press was there, the local and national news cameras, all expecting a fiery speech, perhaps an announcement of her own mayoral campaign. They were disappointed. "They keep asking me what we're going to do now," she began, her voice the same calm, steady force it had been from the very beginning. "They expect us to name a new king, to replace one person on a throne with another, but that was never the point." She looked around the room, her gaze connecting with Carol, with Mr. Abdi, with David Chen, with all the improbable heroes of their quiet revolution. "We didn't do this to seize power," she declared, her voice ringing with a simple, powerful truth. "We did this to remind the powerful where the power truly comes from. It doesn't come from a corner office in City Hall. It comes from here, from this room, from our streets, our schools, our homes. The victory is not that one man has fallen. The victory is that we as a community have finally risen." Her unbreakable bond was not with a single person, but with them, with the collective. She announced that she would not be running for mayor. Instead, she and the core members of Northwood for All were forming a permanent, non-profit citizens oversight committee, a watchdog group to ensure that the city's government, no matter who was in charge, would remain transparent, accountable, and forever in service of its people. Her grand gesture was to give the power she had won directly back to the community. The story ends 1 year later. It is a crisp, bright autumn afternoon in Northwood.
The camera pans across a city transformed not by grand, sweeping changes, but by 1,000 small, meaningful ones. The streetlights on Mr. Abdi's street have been fixed. The literacy program at the library is fully funded again. The park, once neglected, is now filled with the laughter of children playing on new, safe equipment. The final scene takes place at the newly renovated and expanded Northwood Neighborhood Hub. It is thriving. Alejandra is there, not as a director or a politician, but simply as a mother. She is sitting on a bench, watching her son, Mateo, now healthy and strong, play soccer with his friends. She is not the center of attention. She is just a part of the vibrant, beautiful community she helped to save. A new mayor, a sensible, community-focused woman who was elected in the recall, comes over to greet her. Alejandra, the mayor says, the city council just approved the funding for the new West Side clinic. Your committee's report was what convinced them. That's good news, Mayor, Alejandra says with a warm, genuine smile. The people will be glad to hear it. They are not rivals, they are partners. The power structure has been permanently, fundamentally rebalanced. As the mayor walks away, a final, quiet moment of grace occurs. A man, older now, his face humbled by public disgrace and the beginnings of a prison sentence, approaches her hesitantly. It is Richard Thorne. He had been out on bail, awaiting his trial. Ms. Flores, he says, using her name with a respect he had never shown before. I wanted to say it to you. I was wrong. You were right. This place, he looks around at the thriving community center, at the happy children. It is beautiful. You have built something beautiful. It is a quiet, humbled, and utterly sincere confession. Alejandra looks at him, at the ghost of the man who had so casually, cruelly dismissed her, and she feels not a flicker of triumph, not a shred of vengeful satisfaction. She feels only a profound, quiet, and liberating peace. Yes, we have, she says softly. Then she turns her attention back to the soccer field, back to her son, back to the future. The camera slowly pulls back, leaving Thorne alone with his regret, and focuses on Alejandra, a quiet, ordinary woman bathed in the golden afternoon light, her face a portrait of serene, hard-won contentment. She had not set out to topple a regime. She had just wanted to save her son's sanctuary. But in fighting for that one small, precious piece of her world, she had, by the grace of God and the power of her own unbreakable spirit, reclaimed a city for everyone. Her legacy was not a title or an office. It was in the sound of a child's laughter, in the safe passage of a woman walking home under a street lamp, in the quiet, revolutionary belief that every voice matters.